There's been a lot of heartfelt chatter in Australia about reconciliation, that noble-sounding term which I always took to mean, coming together, but now apparently translates to invoices. Lots and lots of invoices. Thanks to Australia's first ever Indigenous truth-telling inquiry, an expensive guilt parade funded by the colonisers, we finally have a clearer picture of what reconciliation actually means. The Yoorrook Justice Commission, which spent 4 years finding new and inventive ways to blame the British for pretty much everything short of Melbourne's weather, tabled its final report in the Victorian Parliament late yesterday, making 100 recommendations, or as Anthony Albanese would call them, generous and gracious requests. I'll go through some of them for you in a moment, but I want to give you some time to grab a tissue because, seriously, these will make your eyes water. While you're bracing yourself for the recommendations, let's start with the Commission's foundational thesis. Victoria was never discovered by the British, never settled, and certainly never founded. No, according to the report, it was illegally occupied. The report says, and I quote, "The taking of country and resources was violent as First Peoples were displaced and massacred by European settlers," that would be your great-great-grandparents, "in the pursuit of Aboriginal people's land and waters." Now, the report insists that 237 years after the British set foot on these shores, and I'm quoting again, "the legacy of colonisation is still manifest in every aspect of life." And no, they're not referring to roads, plumbing or electricity. Then the report makes this claim, quote, "All major political parties, whether in government or in opposition, have perpetuated the compounded trauma, injustice and suffering of First Peoples." All political parties, even the Greens, who've got Welcome to Country on speed dial. Well, with that broad brush stroke of moral condemnation complete, the report then launches into 100 recommendations so ambitious, even Santa Claus would have thought twice about drafting this list. The most stunning recommendation to me is that Indigenous tribes are to be treated as nations, distinct from Australia, not just separate culturally, but legally and diplomatically. The Victorian government, the report insists, should now conduct relationships with Indigenous communities on a nation-to-nation basis. Penny Wong is going to have her work cut out for her. The report notes, quote, "Sovereignty of First Peoples in Victoria has never been ceded and continues to exist." So their plan, as I understand it, is to heal the nation by breaking it up into smaller ones. Can't you just feel the reconciliation? Here I was thinking the goal was to bring us all together. Australians all, let us rejoice, for we are one, they told us, and free. Instead, it means Indigenous Victorians will be regarded and treated as completely separate to their neighbours, as members of different nations with different rights and with an entirely different relationship to the Victorian government. Speaking of which, Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan was asked if she thought the recommendations might be, divisive.
Look, I think the recommendations and indeed the findings, I do acknowledge they are incredibly challenging. They're challenging because they tell the truth. They tell the truth about how our state was colonised, and that does make for some tough reading. When you read about the violence, you read about the massacres, you read about the decisions in the past to forcibly remove children from their family, from their loved ones, from their culture and their people. And so many parts of the report are challenging. And that is why it's been established to be part of that pathway to treaty.
Now, obviously, a lot of what Jacinta Allan said there is highly contested. But let's have a look at some more challenging recommendations, the adoption of which the Victorian Premier is refusing to rule out. The report recommends that Indigenous Victorians should be exempt from taxes, rates and charges relating to water because, as the report notes, the resources belong to them in the first place, which raises the obvious question, if ownership precludes you from paying tax, why is no one proposing homeowners be exempt from stamp duty? I digress. Of course, colonially tainted citizens, well, they'll still be paying tax, but here's the twist, and it's a beauty. A fixed portion of non-Indigenous revenue would go directly into a self-determination fund for Indigenous Victorians. And there's no expiry or time limit, a bit like Netflix subscriptions and government incompetence. It's a financial forever tribute paid by non-Indigenous people to atone for the alleged crimes of their great-great-great-grandfathers. So much for closing the gap. Turns out it's not a gap to be closed, it's a direct deposit in perpetuity. But the Yoorrook commissioners, well, they were just warming up. If the Victorian government adopts the recommendations, and you wouldn't put anything past the Victorian government, the pay of senior public servants would not be tethered to performance, but to how successful they were at employing and promoting Indigenous staff. Want a pay rise in the Victorian public service? Well, you better start keeping a racial hiring ledger. And the demands don't stop there. Churches are in the crosshairs. Any land gifted by the government, illegally transferred by the colonising state, should now be handed back. Logic here seems to be what's yours is ours, and what was once ours must still be ours, even if we gave it away and you built a school on it. And then there's education. Now, brace yourself for this one because it's a doozy. The Commission recommends that Aboriginal children be exempt from existing school attendance requirements. And in the event that an Indigenous student does turn up for class, well, don't ever think about suspension or expulsion. Apparently, behavioural standards, well, they're colonial constructs. Indigenous children would be subject to different behavioural standards. By the time we get to the comparatively tame demand that Victorian maps and signage reflect traditional Indigenous names, well, it almost feels like a reasonable ask, in comparison to nationhood and tax immunity. There are, of course, many more recommendations, 100 in total. Mandated quotas of Indigenous people on company and government boards, the establishment of an Indigenous fire authority, recognising waterways as living entities. But who would speak for a living lake or a living river? Well, Indigenous people understand them, of course, and they would speak on their behalf. And Victorian universities, well, they need to recognise and compensate Indigenous staff for the additional colonial load they bear. I've no idea what that means, and I don't think Jacinta Allan would know what that means either. On and on it goes. But to summarise, reconciliation now involves permanent tax-free status, endless reparations, diplomatic independence, separate rules for schooling, a financial tithe from the general population, and a forced ecclesiastical garage sale. And I haven't even mentioned the Indigenous voice to Parliament that Jacinta Allan is determined, despite a majority of people voting against it less than 2 years ago, to foist upon Victorians. Here's the Premier, having said she wants to establish a voice, now saying the Yoorrook Commission recommendations will help inform a treaty, none of which Victorians ever voted for.
The receipt of the Royal Commission, the Justice Yoorrook Commission's report, is part of that negotiation work, the pathway to treaty that we are now on as a state. The government will take time to consider the depth of the recommendations, and I'm just not going to rule things in or out through a press conference.
For her part, the Victorian Premier says her government shares the Yoorrook Justice Commission's goals of truth and justice. Well, I think everyone would support truth and justice. The problem is how the Victorian Premier, who can't say what a woman is, defines truth. And as for justice, well, I'm not so sure the majority of Victorians will find the Commission's recommendations particularly just. They read less like a plea for justice than like a shopping list drawn up by opportunists holding someone else's credit card. But at least we now know what reconciliation means. Less a coming together, more a constitutional divorce. Less unity, more tax redistribution. Less about living as one and more about creating parallel systems with separate rules, rights and bank accounts. Jacinta Allan handed Indigenous activists a blank cheque and a pen, and now they've come to collect. She says the report lays the foundation for a better future for all Victorians. There's no way she can believe that, let alone go along with any of it, let alone implement the recommendations and expect to be re-elected. But then again, we are talking about Victoria.